Thanks for joining today. Education Commissioner Penny Schwinn is with me here today as we want to start off talking about the proposed revamping of our education funding formula, and then we'll open it up for questions about that or any other subject that you want to have as well. I'll speak a few minutes, then let Commissioner speak, and then we'll open it up to questions. Our public schools are the future of our state, and it is important that we invest wisely in them, and we are proposing a significant rewrite of the way that we fund our public schools. And we embarked several months ago on a process that continues still today. Tremendous amount of input from parents and teachers and stakeholders, and the General Assembly being a part of that. We had 16 town halls and 18 subcommittees, and that work continues still. And what we want to do is provide information along the way. This is an enormous responsibility that we have and an enormous opportunity to prepare our public schools for the future of Tennessee. We're in a state that has had tremendous growth and tremendous change, frankly, in the enrollment in our public schools, and yet our formula is 30 years old, and it's not modernized in a way that meets the needs of the children in our public schools today. So that's what we've embarked upon, and again, it's a tremendous opportunity we have. Most importantly, a tremendous responsibility that we have. So we're working together to make sure that we get that done. We're also investing significantly more dollars into our public schools, and if we're going to do that, then we ought to invest that in a way that makes sense for kids, that makes sense for the system as it exists today, and so it's important that we do this right. We have the capacity and the capability to do this, and it's going to require a tremendous amount of work. It's also going to require the engagement and the communication along the way. Over the next 2 weeks, we'll lay out the details of this plan. Legislation should be filed in the middle of February for this, and then the process will continue with the legislature to make changes as necessary, so we end up with a final product that serves Tennessee and Tennessee's public schools well into the future. Commissioner, if you would come forth and just provide a little bit about the details that we'll be providing over the next few weeks before the final, it won't be the final legislation, but it'll be the legislative proposal that will become final through the session. Commissioner?
Good afternoon. So I am excited to talk more about the proposed funding formula and some of the work that's happened over the last 3.5 months, and even before then. So we know that Tennessee's been discussing public school funding for years now. We've had BEP review committees since 2004. We've had a task force, and now we've had over 3.5 months of public comment. And in that process, as Governor Lee said, we've had town halls. We've had thousands of comments and folks contributing to the conversation. We've had dozens of individual district meetings across the state to hear what individual districts might need for their school communities. And we've also had school funding ambassadors, people who have volunteered to collect feedback in their local communities in order to contribute to the process and inform the work of the subcommittees. There is remarkable consistency in what we are hearing, and I think that's a good thing. Tennesseans across the state have said this is what we value, this is what we want for public schools, and that has been something we've been able to transparently put on our website, talk through, and continue to get feedback from the steering committee on. I just want to say I'm very appreciative of the district folks, the parents, the school leaders, the industry, higher ed, everyone who's contributed to that process. And I do want to say it's time for bold action. I think we have seen states who have gone in circles for years, in some cases decades, with the same conversation and not taken the step forward. There are states right now that are 20 years into their conversation. And so you either have conversation or time for action. And what we know is true is that students are in schools right now. They are in our public schools, ready to learn. And part of this conversation is how do we ensure that they learn the most at the highest possible level every single day. I'm very confident that our school systems are working hard. This is an important conversation, an important moment in time. So the proposed formula, called the Tennessee Investment in Student Achievement, or the TISA, is part of the work that will move forward, and it is intended to ensure that every student in the state of Tennessee has the opportunity to thrive. Over the next couple of weeks, what you will get is more information on the subcommittee recommendations. You can see their final policy recommendations as well as their funding recommendations posted on our website now. Next week, we'll provide more information on how those recommendations have come together, as well as having more information from subcommittee members themselves. And then, as the governor said, in mid-February, we will roll out the proposed legislation. And I do want to thank, again, members of the General Assembly who have sat on those subcommittees and really hashed through those recommendations together. It has been, I think, a really powerful process of what it means for everyone to have a seat at the table and a voice. Before I wrap up comments, I just want to acknowledge something that I know is near and dear to the heart of public schools across the state, and that's teacher compensation. The governor announced a proposal for $125 million in educator compensation and salaries in his proposed budget. I want to make clear that the way in which that goes through would be like every other year. It goes into the instructional component of the BEP. And I think one of the most important policy discussions that we are having is for a new formula. When we commit funding as a state to teacher increases, that goes to teacher pocketbooks. And I think that that is an important potential shift that could be true in new legislation. And it means when we say teachers are going to get a raise, we mean teachers are going to get a raise. And teachers have been working hard, especially over the last 2 years. And I'm very, very excited and very grateful at that commitment to our educators. So whether you have a little kindergartner or first grader, like in my house, a third grader or a high school student, what I know to be true is that people care about kids. And this funding formula is about individual students and meeting the needs of individual students so that they can thrive both in their K-12 education and after. I'm very grateful for us taking this bold first step, and I know that there's a lot of conversation still to come, but ultimately this is about kids. It has to stay about kids, and I'm very grateful for the contributions and feedback that we've heard so far. So thank you, sir.
Thanks. Thank you, Commissioner. And again, this is a tremendous opportunity we have to invest wisely in the future of our state and invest wisely in the future of our public schools. And I too want to commend the General Assembly for their engagement thus far, and there will be robust engagement with them as we go forward. But I feel confident and believe that we can get this done, and that we can do so in a way that that furthers the education for every child in our state that's enrolled in a public school. So thanks for taking the time here, and happy to open it up to questions. And if you don't mind, we could start with questions about this topic, and then we can move to other questions as well. Would you like, yes, go ahead.
My question is about the partnership with Hillsdale College. We've heard some concerns about partnering with a college that's out of state. There's some concerns from parents about public money going to an institution that is religious. What is your response to those concerns?
So our state has had engagement with and desires to create the best public schools in the country, and that includes public charter schools. And Hillsdale, that specific partnership is about engaging Hillsdale in public, classical, secular education. High-quality charter schools are an important part of the equation in our public school system. And we welcome charter operators, nonprofit charter operators from around the country to improve the public school system in our state, and that includes classical education charter schools like Hillsdale.
And the president of Hillsdale turned on tape saying that you asked for 100 charter schools when it was 50. How many schools are you hoping to bring to this program?
You know, that'll be up to Hillsdale. They will make applications, just like any charter school operator in our state. that operates nonprofit charters, public charters. They make the decisions as to how many schools they'd like to have in a state. So that'll be a decision of Hillsdale.
Governor, just in the interest of time, I want to go down in
Yep.
I was listening to your question about
Megan? Okay.
You said that some of the subcommittee recommendations are already available. What are, can you summarize for us some of the recommendations you've heard from subcommittee?
Absolutely, and so the subcommittees, if we think about the base, and so just as a step back, in a student-based funding formula, you have a base, what is true for every student, no matter where they live. You have weights, which is a multiplier for those students who might have additional learning needs. And then oftentimes you have direct funding, which would be direct allocations based on specific needs of students. And so we heard a lot about counselors and nurses and teacher compensation. No surprises there. Again, consistency over time. We've heard about making sure that we fund the things that are currently required in statute. So I think about the Learning Loss and Student Acceleration Act and the need for tutoring. We heard a lot about CTE, making sure that when students graduate from high school, they have the opportunities while they were in our K through 12 systems to earn credit, to earn industry credentials, and certainly to be more advanced in terms of their long-term career trajectory. And I think more than anything, what we heard is a real focus on the actual child in the classroom. So what is it that this student needs to be successful if they have a learning disability, if they speak a language other than English, if they have characteristics of dyslexia? How are we ensuring that funding gets to that child for that child's needs, and how do we report transparently about that? So as a parent, as a teacher, as a district, I know what's coming in, where that money's being spent, and what the outcomes were to support that child. So we heard that consistently across the board. Yeah, I can speak, having been in some states, and certainly we've been looking at the process in other states. Again, remarkable consistency. I would encourage everyone to look at the recommendations from the 2004 BEP Review Committee and how consistent that has been year over year over year since 2004. Similar to a task force in 2014-15, we saw similar recommendations. This is making sure that whether you are in the urban, suburban, or rural subcommittee, the higher education subcommittee, if you are looking at principals or the teachers subcommittee, the student subcommittee, any of the 18, the consistency across the board is really strong. And more importantly, we could talk about public education all day. And I think there is a point where when we see that consistency, when we hear the same thing year after year, it is making the decision to say it's time to act and to ensure that we can get those resources to the students who need them and ensure outcomes and student acceleration occurs.
Well, I was for the commissioner's bill, and I wanted to ask you if you think some of the conversations we're having around obscene materials in school libraries and concerns about curriculum that we're not necessarily able to vet, if that's taking away from real conversations we should be having, or more important conversations we should be having about public schools.
The conversations that are having, and I can say whether I'm talking to a superintendent, a teacher, or my neighbor down the street, it is about kids. And so I think anytime we are having a conversation about students and what is best for students and ensuring that they have every opportunity to be successful, those are the conversations we need to be having. As a parent, I also know it's important for me to be really involved in our public school system. I think that's an opportunity we've been able to see in a number of ways over the last several years, and I continue to encourage conversations that bring everyone into our public schools, really focusing on what's best for kids.
Well, we've increased our funding to public schools every year since we've been here, but we also know that with this new formula, we can more confidently invest additional dollars. So we go through a broad budget process, as you know, and there are a lot of needs and a lot of requirements, and this is a significant expansion of the dollars that we're putting into our public schools. But we're only able to put that significant investment because of this change in the funding formula to modernize it. We think it's a historic investment and one that will help to transform our public schools in a positive way.
Blaine?
What school year do you anticipate this being active and actually being implemented?
Starts not this next school year, but the next school year, 24, the 23-24 year.
Pop over to Kyle real quick. Kyle, you got anything?
Yes. The BEP formula, there is money that follows kids. How is this going to be different from the BEP formula?
You want to address it? I'll say broadly, it simplifies. It's a simpler formula. It takes into account things that are unique to Tennessee now that weren't 30 years ago, the rapid growth of our state and how we compensate for districts that have that rapid growth. It also places emphasis on the specific needs of children, and the old BEP formula didn't do that in the way that this formula does. And Commissioner spoke to ESL or disabilities, dyslexia, concentrated poverty, things that are uniquely different today in our state than they were 30 years ago, and that's why this formula is better adapted for funding. Do you have an additional to that?
Sure, I'm happy to. I think on the calculation component, when we talk about student-based, in the current BEP, it's a resource-based formula. So we might say that a resource is generated by a number of students, but it is still at a systems level. When we talk about a student-based formula, it means that I can look at my child or a child and say, these are the dollars attached to that child. So we know exactly how that child is funded and what services that child's entitled to, as opposed to looking at the aggregate system and then seeing what is generated at that systems level. It's a really important differentiator for a parent. You can imagine a parent getting a report that says, I now know how the state of Tennessee is funding the needs of my specific child and what that means in terms of services and supports to allow my child to thrive. That's not currently how a resource-based formula works, where it's much more about averages in the whole as opposed to the individual student needs.
What's an example of that? Like, what type of child are you and what type of funding would follow them?
So, sure. So let's take the example of a student with a disability as an example. So you might, in the current BEP formula, we have 10 different special education option codes. And you might say that for this option code, you generate one teacher for every 14 students who has that code. That is how we do that in the BEP. In a student-based formula, we say, I'm just going to use the term little Johnny. So little Johnny might have a specific learning disability. Little Johnny might need these 3 services. The funds for those services are attached to Johnny, not to the aggregate, but to that specific child. And that's a little bit of the difference altogether versus looking at each individual student's needs and how we can best support that individual student.
What type of people were in these subcommittees? Like, who are you talking to? Was it
Yeah.
Tennessee Education, Tennessee special educators?
Yep. I was going to say, pick a group, and they were involved. So we had 18 subcommittees, anywhere from 10 plus people on those. We had subcommittees that had parents, teachers, principals. We had superintendents, instructional coaches. We had higher education, business, industry. We had our representative groups like TOS, TSBA, TEA. We also included a number of different community organizations and nonprofits. Essentially, it was to say people who have a voice and have something to say about funding. Everyone needs to be able to be invited to the table and be part of that conversation. But more importantly, even if you weren't on a subcommittee, every single Tennessean had the opportunity to provide public comment, no matter where they lived, whether that was at a town hall, as a school funding ambassador, or student funding ambassador, or through public comment submitted in email, letters, et cetera. So it was a very inclusive process, making sure that no matter where you lived, you could have your voice be heard, and we were thrilled to see such diversity in the feedback that came in from suburban, urban, and rural, and everything in between. It was really wonderful to see how many people used their voice on behalf of kids.
Sam, we got a
Yeah,
quick here.
Governor, you've got legislation that is supposed to enable parents to understand more about the books in libraries and curriculum and so forth. I mean, do you have concerns that this is going to open the door to unnecessary book bans or removal from reading lists and curriculum? If every parent comes in every time they have a concern about something.
I do think that parents, and we've seen across the country really an increased interest in the fact that parents understand and know what their kids are being taught and what are in the books that are in their libraries and in their curriculum as well. And I agree with that. I think parents ought to have the ability to know what their children are learning and to weigh into that process. And there's a process that will engage that input from parents. I think that's the bottom line of this piece of legislation, to give parents input.
But no concern that it could lead to something unnecessary, such as
Well, I think the greatest concern is when parents don't have access to knowing what their children are being taught, and so this will eliminate that.
Back onto the BP stuff, I guess I'm looking for more exact detail. I mean, there's a lot of generalizations out there. Is it your anticipation that you will assign a specific dollar amount to every public school child in Tennessee? And how will you ensure that levy is equitable?
Yeah, those details will be forthcoming in the next 2 weeks. I mean, we will have a proposed piece of legislation in the middle of February, hopefully within the next couple of weeks, that'll actually define what those funds look like in individual districts and counties and related to the students that are in those districts. And the way that's laid out, we believe that it will in fact assign dollars to every child based on their individual need, and that will make that a more fair system for the children in the system.
Can you ensure Tennessee public school parents that vouchers will not be on the table, or is that something that is on the table? Like your research has.
Yeah. So this legislation and this whole approach and this funding formula is entirely about public schools, has nothing to do with private schools.
So vouchers on the table or not? Because I think it's your, if you put a specific dollar amount on each child, potentially to go to whatever public school they want to.
Specifically to go to whatever public school and public school only that they want to.
And also whether you don't mind a storm system moving through, causing some flooding, causing some ice, and there's concern throughout the night. What's your message to Tennessee and who have you been in contact with to monitor the system that's coming?
Yeah, I appreciate you saying that, and we do want Tennesseans to be aware that we have a potentially very dangerous situation with ice, particularly in West Tennessee. There have been multiple counties that have already closed offices across the state. I spoke with the Administrator Criswell from the federal government yesterday at FEMA, specifically talking about our coordination of efforts between TEMA and FEMA and Department of Transportation, and trying to get the message out. So actually, I'm grateful you asked that. I was going to end with comments around that, but I'm glad you asked it, because we do need Tennesseans to understand ice and icing and severe icing is a real possibility in our state, and it's a very dangerous situation. We would expect, I spoke with the head of TVA today. We expect that there will likely be power outages across the state, so people need to be prepared. They need to think in advance about what that means to them individually, and we're prepared to monitor it all night and into the day tomorrow.
Thank you. Ian, we're gonna end with you right here.
Okay. So last night there was a book burning in Mount Juliet. Just wanted to get on record. Do you have a reaction to that, a statement about that?
Yeah, book burning is a bad idea. You'd have to ask the people that are involved in that book burning.
Governor, if I could have one question.
Mhm.
Alexander Wells, William
Sure.
Page. Thank you, Governor. So I'll be quick. I don't know if you're familiar, but there was a demonstration held outside the state capitol last November calling for a new investigation into the 2020 death of Grace Christian Academy senior Grant Storm, which protesters alleged that this death happened under suspicious circumstances. Now, Melanie Dix, a family friend of Grant, also a distant neighbor of yours who's been to your farm, she has sent you multiple letters asking you to consider pushing for a new investigation into Grant's death. So my questions are, one, have you received this letter, or are you familiar with the situation? And two, if you have received this letter or are familiar with the situation, do you have any plans to use your power as governor to push for a new investigation into his death?
So whenever I receive a letter like that, and it's been several months, I may have received a letter with regard to that, then that letter moves on to our either Department of Safety, appropriately so, or Legal Services to determine if there's any reason for our engagement there. But I trust the investigative process there and wouldn't have anything else to say about that.
That's all the time we got. I'm really sorry.
Thank you all.